Hi there, and welcome to this day in history for March 18th. March 18th is the 77th day of the year in the Gregorian calendar, 78th in leap years, with 288 days remaining to the end of the year. Today's word is satire. Satire is a noun that typically refers to a literary work holding up human vices and follies for ridicule or scorn. It can also mean wit or sarcasm used to expose or discredit vice or folly. It can also represent the literary genre comprising such compositions. I'd like to take a moment to mention that links to my sources are included in the show notes. Ask you to go ahead and click that like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Remember that you can share this video with others with a link in your email, messaging, or social media. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section, and there's also a This Day in History playlist, and I'll put a link to that up in the corner up there. With that, we're going to start in the year 1068. March 18th, 1068 marks the date of the 1068 Near East earthquake. This was likely a sequence of earthquakes with epicenters in or near present-day Syria, in an area referred to as the Levant and in the Arabian Peninsula. This one was pretty bad, killing somewhere around 20,000 people. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burned at the stake on March 18th in the year 1314. He'd led the order from 1292 until Pope Clement V ordered it to be dissolved in 1312. Not much is known of his life until he became the Grand Master. Even so, he is one of the best-known Templars. He'd been arrested in 1307 along with other Templars, and they'd been tortured into making false confessions. Later on, when he retracted his confession, King Philip IV of France had him burned at the stake. This bizarre and dramatic end to both the Templars and Molay turned him into quite the legendary figure. He was 70 at the time of his execution. On March 18, 1766, and after 4 months of widespread protest in America, the British Parliament had the good sense to repeal the Stamp Act. This was some of that taxation without representation that you might have heard about in your elementary American history classes. I hope they're still teaching history in elementary school. This is the birthday of John C. Calhoun, born March 18, 1782. He was the 7th Vice President of the United States, and he lived to the age of 68. On March 8, 1852, in New York City, Henry Wells and William G. Fargo, along with some investors, launched their namesake business, Wells Fargo. They started out as a shipping and banking company and are today one of the world's largest banks. This is the birthday of German engineer Rudolph Diesel, born March 18, 1858. He invented the diesel engine. He died mysteriously at the age of 55, having gone missing from his ship while traveling to a business meeting. His body was discovered in the ocean about 10 days later. It's never been definitively solved as to whether he was the victim of an accidental overboard, not likely, a murder, or a suicide. There's evidence either way. We just don't know. Hawaii signed a treaty with the United States granting exclusive trade rights on March 18, 1874. This is the birthday of American mystic and psychic Edgar Cayce, born March 18, 1877. He lived to the age of 67. On March 18, 1911, Irving Berlin copyrighted what came to be the biggest pop song of the early 20th century, Alexander's Ragtime Band. This was actually before radio. It became popular by sheet music. People would go to the store and buy sheet music. They'd have instruments at home that they'd play, entertain themselves at night. Sales of this music topped 1.5 million copies in the first 18 months after its publication. This is the birthday of author Richard Condon, born March 18, 1915. He had quite a distinctive style of writing and subject matter. Several of his works have been made into movies. One of the titles that you might have heard of is The Manchurian Candidate. Now I have to go get some of his books and read up. Maybe I'll tell you about that later. Mr. Condon lived to the age of 81. This is the birthday of American race car driver and businessman Andy Granatelli, born March 18, 1923. He was born right over in Dallas. He lived to the age of 90. On March 18, 1925, the worst tornado in U.S. history hit, and it wasn't in Oklahoma, it wasn't in Kansas, and it wasn't even in Texas. This one went through Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. What came to be known as the TriState Tornado killed 695 people, left 13,000 injured, $17 million in damages. And remember, that was back in 1925. Tri-State Tornado. It had quite a lengthy track, 219 miles. It was on the ground for over 3 hours. I'm glad they're not all like that one. This is the birthday of American actor and director Peter Graves, born March 18, 1926. He lived to the age of 83. You might remember him from Mission Impossible, the original Mission Impossible. He was also in Airplane, the comedic one. Henry and Clement Studebaker opened a blacksmith shop in 1852, and before long they became the leading builder of horse-drawn carriages. They even supplied carriages to the U.S. Army during the Civil War. They came into building cars around the turn of the century, early 1900s, first under the name of Studebaker Garford and then under their own name, Studebaker, in 1913. They continued to make wagons until 1920. Studebaker acquired Pierce Arrow in the late 1920s and sold a number of cars, but the Depression hit them hard, and on March 18, 1933, Studebaker was forced to file bankruptcy. The company was able to recover somewhat, start making cars again, but eventually they transitioned out of the automobile business for good in 1966. The Hawaii Admission Act was signed into law on March 18, 1959. This was an act to provide for the admission of the state of Hawaii to the Union, dissolving the territory of Hawaii and establishing the state of Hawaii as the 50th state of the Union. Hawaii's statehood became effective later in the year. Perhaps we'll talk about that again when it happens. This is the birthday of James McMurtry, born March 18, 1962. He was born right here in Fort Worth. One might describe his genre as a range of American rock, folk, rock Americana, maybe a little bit of outlaw. It came to our attention one time when we were at a concert for something else, and they were playing background music, and it was Choctaw Bingo. If you're familiar with that song, it caught our ear because we've known people like that, and we've been to many of the places that he mentions in that song. James McMurtry. On March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Alexi Leonov became the first person to walk in space. On March 18, 1968, the U.S. Congress repealed the requirement for a gold reserve to back the U.S. currency. This is the birthday of American rapper, producer, and actress Queen Latifah, born March 18, 1970. On March 18, 1990, Germans in the German Democratic Republic voted in the first democratic elections in the former communist dictatorship. ArtNapping. On March 18, 1990,
13
art pieces,
11 paintings,
and 2 sculptures, collectively worth around $500 million, were stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston in the largest art theft in U.S. history. So far, none of the paintings have been recovered. Now, these are not paintings that someone could just stick in a new picture frame and hang in their living room and not get somebody's attention. They're not paintings that someone could sell to someone else without getting in a lot of trouble. The museum is offering a $10 million reward for information leading to the art's recovery. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. I know I sure did. I always do. I will have by now already put the link to this Day in History playlist up there in the corner for you. I also post these videos on my blog. There's a link to that in the show notes. And I guess that's it. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. That doesn't sound right. I don't think I have that right, so we're gonna take that out. Thank goodness for editing. 95, Mississippi, Okay, we'll do that in a minute. All right, let's back that up just a little bit. The Volkswagen microbus, so many mistakes. I don't know how all that's going to go together, or if it's even going to make it to the video. We'll just see. That's not going to go. Probably cut all that out. That'll all be laying on the cutting room floor. So I'll just do that whole thing over. That might not make it into the video. We'll see. Changing it up.